of A Frankfurt Prairie, An Awakening with Kathy Wells Power. Housekeeping recap for those that entered after. I said it a minute ago. Please keep yourself muted and your videos turned off during the presentation. Also, if you have any questions during the presentation, we're going to have ask them at the end, but you are free and more than welcome to ask them in the chat during the presentation, just in case you don't forget and have several questions for her. And we'll relay that to her. If anything happens and you can't get back in, we are streaming live on YouTube, and you can also ask your questions there in the video chat. So without further ado, I have a warm welcome for Kathy Wells Power. She is a native North Texan with close ties to Frankfurt Church and Cemetery, with 4 lines of ancestors in the Frankfurt Cemetery. She served as a president of the Frankfurt Cemetery Association from 2008 to 2020. The church was under major renovation when Kathy decided it needed a native landscape out front and called upon local landscape architect Rosa Finsley. While out there surveying the property, Rosa noticed a few rare prairie plants among the mowed lawn. It was then that Kathy's proud Texan heritage kicked in and saved the small Blackland Prairie remnant known as Frankfurt Prairie. Thank you, Kathy, from the bottom of all of our hearts, for your dedication, for your years of literal sweat equity, and for sharing this treasure with us today.
Thank you, Cindy. I'm delighted to be with you today, and thanks so much for inviting me to share our story. I'm starting with water because there wouldn't be a Frankfurt if it hadn't been for the Everlasting Springs, which is on the west bank of our creek that runs through the property. We have a creek that we refer to as Hall's Branch that is a tributary of White Rock Creek in Dallas, and it runs through the Frankfurt site. Let me go forward and see if I can find a map that will show you where, well, I'll show that to you in a little bit. I'll just tell you in general where Frankfurt is. I don't know, some of you may be from Dallas and some may not be from Dallas, but the Frankfurt site is on the north, is in the northern part of the city. There's, if you know about the toll road, it's if you go north on the toll road, north of LBJ freeway, there's several exits for a little town called Addison. And then if you exit it off of Trinity Mills or Frankfurt Road and turn to the right, it's off in that area to the east of the toll road. And it wasn't annexed into the city of Dallas until 1978 when they built a subdivision called Bentry North. So when I was a kid going to Frankfurt, it was way out in the boonies. And I mean, there was nothing there but fields being farmed and farmhouses. And of course, today we are smack dab in the middle of a subdivision, except that we're kind of buffered. We have enough land around the prairie and the church that we're kind of buffered a little bit from the subdivision. So anyway, this is the creek, Hall's Creek, that runs through the property. And this is another view looking up from Hall's Creek. This is a little pathway we created. There's a little bench there so you can sit and look across. On the other side over here would be where the site of Indian Springs is. And this is a view of the creek from a bridge that crosses the Frankfurt site. And if you look, can't see it real well, but kind of in this area, there's an old, very old piece of concrete that was probably put there from the 1930s. This was after there was a little town called Frankfurt, and by the 1930s, the little town was no longer in existence, and somebody capped off, or they covered up, the source of Indian Springs. and we think to provide more pressure to a spring further south called Keller Springs. But at any rate, we discovered it when I first went on the board, and anyway, I got interested wondering where that was, and we found where it was, and we had a little ceremony, and we had these guys with crowbars remove the cap from the spring, and the spring started flowing again, which was very, very exciting. And this is a closer up version. And you can see some ferns, and there's moss growing around there, and all indicators that there's water, indications that there's water there. It doesn't, we had a hydrologist who helped us with this project, and he said, now, once we remove the cap, don't expect for it to have the force that it would have had hundreds of years ago. And it doesn't. It's kind of like a seep, really, more than anything. But it has never stopped flowing since we uncapped it. And we have master naturalists. There's a group of master naturalists called the Stream Team who go around and test all the water in the everlasting springs in the Dallas area. And there are many everlasting springs. And they have been doing this faithfully for the last 8 years, I think now. And they report that the water, the purity of the water of the spring is just amazing, which is why the Native Americans camped there. This is a closer up shot of the, whoops, let me go back, of the spring. This is the hole that the spring, the water comes out of. And this is just, the Frankfurt site was on the Shawnee Trail, which is loosely where east and west of Preston Road, for those of you who know Dallas. Preston Road is a major road that goes through Dallas. And it started down, some historians think that it actually started down near Brownsville and snaked. It was a natural escarpment, a raised escarpment that made for a really good pathway for people, for travelers, people traveling on foot. So the Native Americans, probably as far back, they think at least to the 1400s, I think probably even earlier than that, they would travel along the Shawnee Trail, and they camped where there were sources of food and water. And so that's why they camped near everlasting springs like at Frankfurt. And I think they may have feasted on some of the plants that we now know that are in the prairie, which we'll be looking at those in a minute. This is just a map for those of you who are interested to see where it is. And if you are interested in going there, we can send you directions and a map later. But this, so this is, here's the toll road, and off to the east. It's not too far, a little further north of Frankfurt is the George Bush Freeway, I guess they call it. So that's generally where it is. This is the earliest picture that we have of the little church of Frankfurt. As I said, Frankfurt was a little community. It was a farm community, and it existed loosely from the 1850s to the early 1900s. And it had a little post office, so it was official. There were probably never more than about 90 residents in the community. But it had the White Rock Masonic Lodge was there. It had which served as church in the early days before the church was built. The lodge building, which is loosely where the cemetery is today, it served as a church and kind of a community center and a school. And it was considered to be one of the finest schools in that area. So people would kind of move near there so their kids could go to school there. And this church was completed in 1897. As Cindy said, I went on the board. I was asked to go on the board in 2008, and I was immediately made president. And we we had our organization, of course, a lot of us who are involved with Frankfurt, and of course, many people on the board, we're not all of us, but a lot of us are descendants of some of the, our ancestors are laid to rest in this community. And so we were at a time in the early 2000s where some people in the organization were thinking, well, maybe we need to make some changes. Maybe we need to make it into an historic theme park, or maybe we need to add a gazebo, or maybe we need to do this and that. But there were some of us, and I was in this camp, that went, don't think so. What's beautiful and wonderful about Frankfurt is that it's pretty much the way it always has been. And we didn't really want to develop it in any way or to change it. And so, but we did decide we wanted to save the church. So we started a very, very careful restoration of the church. And we were fortunate because the church, unlike there are other North Texas churches around, but a lot of them have been changed and altered. Maybe a room has been added, or there have been some architectural changes that have been made. But this one is it was very much this way it had been in 1897 when it was completed. So we hired an architecture firm called Architects in Dallas. They specialize in working on old buildings, and because we wanted their guidance. And I'm awfully glad in retrospect that we did that, because you can make a lot of mistakes unintentionally when you're restoring an old building. So this is right after we'd started the restoration. And this is one of the workmen, Rosa Finsley, whom Cindy mentioned. She's a wonderful landscape architect in Dallas, and we had brought her in to help us create a landscape around the church using native plants, which we thought would be appropriate. And she was very concerned that there be proper drainage. So we're putting in, these are limestone blocks that we had on another part of the site that we brought in to create a diversion for the water, which it's worked miraculously. Rosa was spot on about the need for that. This is me watering in some plants that we put in. We used native plants in our design around the church. And of course, Rosa selected all of them. This is salvia, looks like. This tree is a Texas red bud. This is the landscape as it was getting established. And this is coralberry, which is gorgeous now. Of course, it's very full and it's lovely. We do have some native coralberry down near the creek too, which is neat. So Rosa's idea, around the church, we have mostly native plants, native and adaptive plants that she calls them pass-along plants, like our grandmothers and great-grandmothers might have had in their gardens. It's not as wild and natural as the prairie, which we're going to see in a minute. And this is me in this would have been probably May of 2010. We were at the end of the restoration project, and the whole restoration project had taken about 9 months. And by that time, I think Rosa, she knew me well enough, and she felt it was safe to ask me about seeing what we could do about stopping the mowing and to see what might come up. As Cindy mentioned, the first day Rosa came really to talk about the restoration project, she was immediately out in the fields between the cemetery and the church. And I was kind of puzzled by that, because I thought we were going to be hanging around the church. But that very first day, it was a hot day in August of 2009. We had just mowed and it was very dry. Despite all of that, she saw some native plants in the prairie that were doing their best to hang on for dear life. But then we had, she mentioned it, we talked a little bit about it, but then we had to work on the restoration project. So then 9 months later, at the end of the restoration project, she turned to me one day and she said, what would you think about just picking a couple of sections of our fields and stopping the mowing just to experiment to see what might come up? And I said, okay. Well, so we started small. We started with a small section. We have two main sections, the east and the west meadow. We started with the west meadow, which is on the church side. Well, we had a problem. We had a lot of invasives, particularly an invasive called scabiosa. And it's very aggressive. I forget which country it comes from, but it's very aggressive, and it will crowd out the native plants. And we had so much of it that Rosa said if we didn't get rid of it, it wasn't going to be a successful project. And I don't know that she meant it to be that way, but I took that as a challenge and I went, we can make this work, it's going to be a successful project. So I just sat down one day and just started digging. And then we brought in a couple of men that had helped Rosa with other projects, and they were had an awareness of native plants. And with the three of us, Ricardo, Javier, and I worked 3 years just during the growing season, every Friday and Saturday, most every Friday and Saturday, pulling the non-natives. And looking back, had we not done that, I don't think we'd have what we have today. So I'm grateful to those two men. This is something that cropped up during those first few months in really the summer of 2010. We were pulling mostly the scabiosa that I mentioned, and there were a few other invasives. But things were popping up all the time, and this plant popped up, and I had no idea what it was. It was different from anything else we had. And I called Rose. I was standing there. I called her on my cell phone, standing in the middle of the prairie, and asked her what it was. I didn't send her a picture, I don't think, at that time. And I tried to describe it to her. And she said, I'm not sure what it is you're describing, but don't pull it until, don't touch it until I can get there. Well, 2 weeks later, she came, and it was probably late June of 2010. It was a Sunday afternoon. It was about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and the sun was setting. I will never forget it. And by that time, it had sent up its seed stalk, and it had the turkey foot. It was big blue stem. Rosa gasped, because at that moment she knew, and there was a huge, maybe the size of a 2-car garage. It was a fairly huge section. And it was just, there it was. And it had probably been mowed at least 60 years, and maybe closer to 75 years. So it was like the whole prairie just came back to life so amazingly. I think I like to think that it was happy. It was thrilled that we were allowing it to grow again after all those years. So that was a turning point, because we knew that because it's very rare to have big blue stem, particularly in an urban area that's indigenous to your site. So to have this was just amazing. We knew it was the real, as Rosa liked to say, it was the real deal. So I know many of you know about the Blackland Prairie. This is just a map that shows where the Blackland Prairie is in Texas. And you can see Dallas is right pretty much in the middle of it. So, and the Frankfurt site, from what I have read about the Blackland Prairie, is a pretty good example of a Blackland Prairie site. The tall grass prairie can go on for miles and miles and miles without any creeks or anything. But the Blackland Prairie tends to be tucked between the creeks. And of course, that's the case at Frankfurt. This is another example of the big blue stem, and with the restored church in the background. And I think I took this picture with my phone. This is the big blue again. I mean, it's just, and it varies. This year, it's not as tall as it is in this picture. It can grow as tall as 8 feet tall. I love this picture. I love looking at the church through the big blue stem. And the big blue stem is probably the tallest of any of the plants that we have in the prairie. This is Indian Springs, which I mentioned. We've had a number of Boy Scout projects, and Rosa created this design. It's a path that leads you down to the location of the spring. And this sign, this Indian Springs sign, was carved out of a piece of bodark. We try to use what we have at Frankfurt, and of course we have bodark trees. In fact, the church is held up by bodark piers, which was a very common type of foundation in the 1890s for buildings in the Dallas area. This is a bench that the Boy Scouts built, and I think there was a picture of that from looking up from the creek in an earlier picture that I showed you. So if you can't go all the way down to the creek to look at the spring, you can sit on that bench and get a pretty good view of it. And this is another picture looking up from the creek up to the pathway and the bench at the top. This is one of my favorite plants in the prairie. It's a silver blue stem. And I love it because when the sun is setting and it just looks like jewels when you see the sun shining through it, either early morning when the sun's coming up or in the evening when it's going down. Anyway, it's just absolutely gorgeous, I think. This is another picture of the silver blue stem. And one thing I need to say, there are other wonderful projects in Dallas. Some of you may have heard of Connemara, and there's a section over in East Dallas near White Rock Lake that's native, or they're trying to convert. Anyway, it's semi-native. And all of these projects are wonderful. I did not realize, I mean, the prairie was kind of dropped in my lap. I wasn't an expert. I mean, I'd grown up on a farm, so I had an agricultural background and I was interested in it, but I still don't consider myself really an expert. But what's unusual about what we have is that, particularly to have it in the middle of the city, is that it's a prairie that came to life again. We're not having to recreate it. So we don't bring in plants. Rosa counseled me from the very get-go. When we realized what we had, she said, we're not going to bring anything new in. We're going to remove the plants, the non-native plants, the exotic plants that would crowd it out, and let the prairie restore itself. And that is, I realize now, kind of an unusual approach, but I know now it's been the right approach for us, because in our case, it was literally like this lost world that was coming back again. So what we do, one of the master naturalists that helps us remove the non-native, she says, what we're doing is we're liberating the prairie. And I love that. I think that's exactly what we're doing. This is Engelmann Daisy that blooms, starts blooming in May and lasts until the first week or two in June. And it's gorgeous. There's a windmill that we have on the site that I think is everybody loves. I have to say one thing about the windmill. Because of the COVID situation, of course, like a lot of nonprofits, we've had to cancel events like tours and concerts that we have. So I thought, well, let's try to get some projects done. So I found a windmill, a man who works on historic or vintage windmills, and he restored the whole windmill, put in a new motor, and the blades are turning again. They hadn't turned in many, many years. So that's exciting. So now when you enter the site, you've got the windmill blades turning, and it just makes everything feel like it's alive. This is Gaillardia. Here's the front of the church. This is an area, I call it the Little Prairie. It's near the church, and I love it because it's got really a lot of the plants that we have in the main two prairie sections. So for people who want to come and see it, they don't have to go, when we have tours, the only time we allow people into the prairie is when we have tours, guided tours. And, but if you're not able to get into the prairie, you can see pretty much what the prairie is like by studying the Little Prairie. And this is Gaillardia, our Indian blanket. We've cataloged the plants, the native plants that we have in the prairie, and it's about, between the grasses and the forbs, it's about 250 and climbing. This is back to the church. This is the native Texas redbud that Rosa planted, and these are the coral berries that I showed you before when they were just babies. This is a close-up of the Engelmann Daisy. And some of you may know, but the Engelmann Daisy apparently at one time was considered, when they were trying to think of a state flower for Texas, and of course it was beaten out by bluebonnet. But apparently the Engelmann Daisy, according to, I think Rosa told me this, it blooms in almost, if not every county, almost every region, maybe not every county, but almost every region in Texas, which is pretty amazing when you think of the diversity of Texas. This is blue or purple skullcap, and this was the plant that Rosa first saw that hot day in August of 2010 that made her think that we might have a prairie. And I love it. It's really pretty. And of course you can buy, I think you can buy these in nurseries that feature native plants. And this, I believe, is a close-up of Verbena, which we have in a native variety, of course. Of course, everything we haven't planted anything. These are all things that have been there forever. I love this picture because it shows, this is very typical of what you have in a prairie. This is the blue skullcap in the background with four-nerve daisy mixed in with it. And you see this a lot where the flowers grow together. In the prairie, and a lot of you probably already know this, but you've got different, it keeps evolving through the years. Rich James, who's a botanist who helps us with our tours, he compares it to a 3-act play. So you've got, in the spring, you've got, that's forb season. That's when the flowers, and not that we don't have flowers at other parts of the year, but that's when you have the most flowers. And then as summer, if you move into summer, you moved into grass season. And now the grasses are turning russet color. And so you'll move into a kind of dormant season. That's when we mow it. Well, I'll show you that in a minute. We only mow once a year because we don't have buffalo. And it's our way of clearing everything off to keep the prairie vibrant. This is another picture of the Engelmann Daisy. And this is once a year, the first couple of years after we discovered the prairie, we really didn't mow it. And then we were realizing that we needed to do something at least once a year. So we decided to do it in the winter. And so either very late December or early January, we have a guy with a big tractor come and he mows down both prairie remnants. And this is just another picture of him going around the prairie. And you can see these are some of the houses. I told you we're in the middle of a subdivision. If you were to go to Frankfurt now, you would not see these houses because we extended our tree line. You can see some little trees there. They are now huge. Rosa wanted us to, in her words, own the view. And so we had a little bit of a tree line, but we added to it. And now you really can't see any of these houses. So when you get into the site, even though we only have, the whole site is a little less than 11 acres, it really gives you a sense of being on a prairie, even though you're in the middle of the city. And these are some of our Boy Scouts planting some of these trees, adding the trees to our tree line. These are tours. Shortly after we discovered the prairie, we decided to start having tours. And so we have them. Of course, this year we've had to cancel them, but we normally have them. We have a spring tour and we have a fall tour. So we have one in the Forbes season where the Forbes are blooming, and then one well, usually in October, during grass season. And this would have been in October. This gentleman right here with the blue cap on is Matt White, who wrote the book Prairie Time. I don't know if any of you are familiar with that book. It's a series of essays on the Blackland Prairie, and it's just a fabulous book. And we met him, and he loves our prairie, and he has conducted tours there. This is another picture of, you can see the people on the tour are almost hidden in this is the big blue stem, and this is the color it turns at this time of the year. This is Rich James. He's the botanist who helps us with our tours, and he's very, very knowledgeable about native plants and very entertaining, and people love to listen to him explain about the plants. Another picture of Rich. This is Matt White, I mentioned before, who wrote Prairie Time, and this is his wife and 4 daughters when they came one day for a tour. That's the back of my head. This is milkweed. We have, I think, 3 varieties of milkweed in our prairie. And with a lot of these plants, we'll have several varieties. We have several varieties of onions. We have several varieties of sunflowers and milkweed and different things. This is the Wagon Yard. West of the creek is an area that we refer to as the Wagon Yard. It's literally where the covered wagons camped. Sometimes there were as many as 25 wagons there. And it's about 3 acres. It's about 3 acres. And we're not planning on building there. We use it sometimes for overflow parking, but we also allow the neighbors to play within reason. We have rules, but we allow them to play frisbee with the dogs and things like that. It is not as native. The grass area is not, it had been tilled, which of course the Frankfurt Prairie had not. But it's so we do allow people to, we do keep it mowed regularly and let the neighbors enjoy it. And I think this is a persimmon tree on the banks of the creek on the Wagon Yard side. And these are the red bud. Rosa added some native plants. We had these limestone blocks that, anyway, had been put there years ago to delineate, to keep people from parking on our property. And I thought they looked a little rigid, so we softened them with the look with some of these native trees. And this is just another view of the creek along the Wagon Yard area. This is the entrance to Frankfurt. This is another boat arc sign that we had made. And this is, you can see the edge of the cemetery. Here's the church, here's the prairie, and here's the cemetery. And the cemetery had people like the Coit family. For those of you from Dallas, you'll know Coit Road. The Coit family were a very important early family in the northern part of what's now Dallas. And they are laid to rest there, as well as Addison Robertson, for whom the town of Addison is named. So a lot of people of regional interest are buried there. And these are some, this is one of the 3 rail beds that Ricardo is working on, that Rosa created on the edge of the prairie. And here again, she used pass along plants, perennials, and they're just wonderful. And this is Rosa and Ricardo and his father-in-law, Javier. They were the 2 that helped me so much in the prairie. They are adding, we had applied for and received the historic, the Dallas Historical Marker, the Historic Texas Cemetery, which is a very prestigious marker you can get for historic cemeteries. So we were proud to get that. They were erecting that. And this is the inside of Frankfurt Church. The wood is longleaf yellow pine that was brought in from Jefferson in East Texas, and it's pretty much extinct today, but it was used in a lot of buildings in the Dallas area then because it was the hardest pine. Of course, pine is generally very soft, but it was a hard pine. And anyway, we think it's beautiful. The church was built by a local builder from the little town of Renner. There's a road called Renner Road that's named for the town of Renner. It's still there today. Of course, the town of Renner is gone. But he was just a local builder. He built the Coit home and a cotton gin. And we think he did a magnificent job. And people, it's very simple. The church is not fancy. It doesn't have fancy stained glass windows. It's just, there's something about the warmth of the wood, and it's just got it's got a beautiful simplicity about it that really resonates with people. Here's another view from the front of the back of the church, looking forward. This is the original organ to the church. It's still a pump organ. And before I went on the board for years, going back to the 1970s, I was the organist on Decoration Day, which is the day that we come to celebrate Frankfurt every year, and always in May. And so I love this view with the light streaming in. And as I said before, this is very, very much like the way it would have looked originally in 1897 when they completed it. This is Rosa again, and Jeff Cummings, who worked at that time worked for Architects, and he was our project manager on the restoration project. He is now on our board. So he fell in love with Frankfurt. It's easy to do that. And me. And this was, I think, 2012, maybe. There was a wonderful article in the morning news. It was around the time that we had uncapped the side of the old spring. And so they did a wonderful article. And this is Christmas on the Prairie, which the first year, of course, we're not a church. We have this church building, but we're no longer a church. And so we were so excited after what we discovered and what was happening at Frankfurt that I wanted to have some sort of an event. And one day I just thought, Christmas on the Prairie, we could have a little candlelight service in the church. And I thought maybe we'd do it once or twice. Well, it caught on, and this year will be the 10th year of Christmas on the Prairie, the 10th consecutive year. And people come from all over. Of course, we can't do it in person this year. We're going to try to do it virtually. And I've already got the minister and the musicians and everybody lined up. But people absolutely love it. And it's so much so that a couple of years ago, we had to start having two because it's so popular, and the church only holds 150. So, but it's very simple. We just sing Christmas carols, and we have some musicians who play Appalachian folk carols. And anyway, it's wonderful. And this is a wonderful picture of the church at night. We've had wonderful photographers who come, and they've taken fabulous pictures of Frankfurt. So now we're going to go back to the prairie, and you see these flowers. These are wild blue hyacinths. The first year, this is the East Prairie. You can see here's the church, here's the windmill, the creek is back here. So this is the East Prairie at Frankfurt. And it was this last prairie that we converted, that we stopped mowing. And the first, maybe March, after we stopped mowing it, maybe in, let's say it was January of that year. And in March, I got a call from a photographer and who'd been doing some photography out there. And he said, Kathy, have you been to Frankfurt lately? And I said, well, it's been a few days. And he said, you need to get out here. This whole meadow is covered with these flowers. I don't know what they are, but they're light blue and they're gorgeous. So I got out there, and this is what I saw. And turns out it's called Camassia psiloides, or wild blue hyacinth. They like limestone prairies, which of course is what we have at Frankfurt. And apparently there's some other spots in North Texas that have them. I haven't seen them anyplace else, but I think there are a few other places. This is, okay, this is another plant. This is, it kind of got out of sync, but these are wild onions. We have several varieties of wild onions. This is back to the hyacinths. And they start at first, they're just a few of them pop up, and then they become more and more prolific. And this is a view from the bottom up. Of course, they bloom from the bottom up. Whoops. And this is when they're close to their peak. They just get more and more blue, and it's just, they're gorgeous. And the first year, they're mainly in our East Meadow. We've had a few. I'd like to have more of them in the West Meadow, but they have spread. We have more of them now in the prairie, and people come from all around to look to see them. And we try to time the timing of. We try to have the timing of our spring tour around when they're going to be blooming, but of course they're going to come up when they're going to come up. Usually it's around the 10th or 11th of April when they're really blooming. This is another close-up. And Rosa likes to say that the hyacinth saved us. And what she means by that is that when we first started the project, of course, as I mentioned, we're in the middle of a subdivision now. And a lot of the neighbors around there, they walk through the site for exercise and just, to be outside in nature. And when we started letting the prairie grow, a lot of these folks didn't understand what we were doing. They thought it was just a big weed patch. And, of course, it was our property, but they thought of it as their own space because that area was built. When it was built without parks. So we were pretty much the only open space. So we had been used as their open space. So little by little, I just talked to them and I said, I'm learning just like you are. This is an experiment. We're just going to see what's going to happen. But then the hyacinths came up. And as Rosa likes to say, who could not think the hyacinths are beautiful? So she likes to say that they saved us. But really, there was kind of a turning point when they came up. I think people realized that the prairie was absolutely beautiful, and that it adds a lot to their quality of life. This is a perfect example of how it starts blooming at the bottom, and I think that's really pretty. Another pretty picture. Okay, about the time when I was first working in the prairie, I mentioned it was those first 3 years, I spent a lot of time pulling non-natives in the prairie. And my mind, when you're sitting there in a prairie pulling and pulling and pulling, your mind wanders and you start thinking about all sorts of things. So I started thinking about the history of Frankfurt. And I got to wondering if maybe there were some old timers still alive who could enlighten us a little bit and share some of their memories and their knowledge of Frankfurt. So we started an oral history project, and I announced it one day at Decoration Day in May. I announced it to some of the folks that came for that. And I said, now, if anybody that we want to start this oral history project, and I said, we're going to start with the folks in their 90s. And so if you know of anybody that you think might be good for us to interview, let us know. So a gentleman came up to me afterwards and he said, honey, you need to talk to my cousin Olita. And I said, okay. And her name was Olita House. She was descended from the Cook family, which was a family that came in 1845 from Illinois to Collin County and settled very near on the west side of where Frankfurt is. And oh my goodness. And she was 93, I think, the first time we interviewed her. She died a couple of years ago. Her goal was to live to be 100, which she made. She died a couple of months after she was 100. But she had almost a photographic memory, and she was the family's historian, and she had all of this amazing information that was very helpful. And in addition to that, she was an artist. And after she died, her grandson gave Frankfurt this wonderful, wonderful picture of the Cook family farmstead, which would have been near where Frankfurt is today, that we're going to feature in a tiny little house that we're building that will have restrooms and things for us. So she was really a treasure. This is a brush arbor that we created. The second person that we did oral history with was a man named Leon Hogan, and he remembered coming to Frankfurt Decoration Day as a little boy, probably in the 20s, and he remembered that they always created a crude shelter called a brush arbor to keep the flies and the sun off the food. And so when we restored the church, we tried our best to recreate that. This is a lady. This is a picture that somebody gave me. This woman's name was Lavona Massey Cudd, and she is laid to rest in the cemetery. She was the midwife for the town of Addison, which is very near Frankfurt, and she brought into this world over 900 babies. And she is sitting, Rosa and I think this is a perfect example of what happened to the prairie. She's planting corn. This is a corn planter. So of course, this is one of the reasons that we don't have that much prairie left today. But and this is a picture of her. This is Caddy Coit, Catherine Bunting Coit. I mentioned the Coits before. She is laid to rest in the cemetery. She and her husband came to the Frankfurt area and settled near the town of Renner, which is just east of Frankfurt, in the 1850s. And this is a picture of how she would have looked at that time. And she was a remarkable woman. I included her in this because she left behind, she was very, very, she was highly educated. She graduated top of her class at a small college women's college in South Carolina. And she taught school once she got here to this area. She knew Greek and Latin, and she wrote many, many letters and left a diary. And a lot of these writings that she left they're now at the Dallas Historical Society. And when I have time, I want to try to transcribe a lot of them. But in some of these writings that she left behind, she talks about the prairie, and she describes it very poetically and she appreciated the prairie. She seemed she thought it was beautiful, but she also seemed to understand how important it was in practical terms. She would write about how she would let the animals go out into the prairie, kind of giving them a little snack, because she knew that the plants out in the prairie were very would have been tasty for them. And she also describes waking up on a spring morning and looking out of her cabin and seeing the whole prairie just awash in flowers. So I like to think that when we were bringing back the Frankfurt prairie, which would have been very near her prairie, that we were bringing the prairie back to Caddy. And this is the Coit's cabin, which would have been near Frankfurt. Later on, they built a grand Victorian home, but this would have been the early cabin that they lived in. And this is the Coit monument in the cemetery. And this is just another view of Frankfurt Church. And about the time of, and as I said, I went on the cemetery board, the Frankfurt Cemetery Association board in 2008. At that time, when we restored the church, the whole Frankfurt property was owned by Frankfurt Cemetery Association. And shortly after we discovered the prairie and realized the significance of it, we decided to split the church and the prairie off from the cemetery to create a new organization whose mission would be to teach North Texas history through our site. And the name of that organization is Frankfurt Preservation Foundation. It is a sister organization to Frankfurt Cemetery Association. So the two organizations kind of work together to preserve and protect this very rare site in Dallas. And we have, as I mentioned before, we have Christmas on the Prairie. We have 2 tours normally during the year. And a couple of years ago, we started a concert series called our On the Prairie concert series. So we try to, as I say, our mission is to teach North Texas history and to celebrate it. And we've been told that there's really not another site quite like Frankfurt that is left in Dallas. So we're doing this for future generations, and we're hoping that our efforts will, we hope that it will, that years from now, 20 years from now, 50 years from now, that Frankfurt will still be there so that people can come and get a taste for, in the middle of the city, of what the early, you know, early North Texas looked like. And about we discovered this wonderful quote from John Muir that I think is very appropriate for Frankfurt. Everybody needs beauty as well as bread, places to play in and pray in, where nature may heal and give strength to the body and soul. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kathy. That was awesome. We have so many comments and what a great presentation this was.
Oh, thank you. Should I stop share? Is that?
Oh, no, leave this up. I want to keep looking at it.
Okay.
We do have several questions while I scroll through to get to the beginning of them. Can you, my question or request is, can you talk about why you believe this prairie has remained intact and not plowed?
Yes, it's a little complicated, but that's a very good question. Shortly after we discovered it, I was going, why is this here? And it became obvious. It seemed like these plants had not been planted there. So I have copies of all the original deeds to the property, which go back to 1873. And I went back and I pulled them out and I studied them. And then I already knew a certain amount of the history. My mother was a Collin County historian, and she was the historian who'd been responsible for getting our first historical markers, Texas historical markers. So I had some of her research too. Anyway, I cobbled it all together. And what happened is in 1873, there was a man named Captain McCamey who owned a lot of land around there. And he was connected to the cemetery and the church, and he sold the land, the church and prairie land, to the White Rock Masonic Lodge, and then eventually the Cemetery Association owned it. And at some time, there was a period of time when they thought they were going to add graves to the cemetery, and one thing happened, one thing after another happened, and they never did that. And so the prairie was still there. And then, as I say, when I was a kid, nobody knew it was the prairie. And it was mowed sporadically. My dad, who was president of the little cemetery association, he would always send somebody out to mow it down so we could park on it, for Decoration Day. But I really think that nobody quite knew as the years went by, it's like the prairie went out of people's imaginations after it was gone. I can't explain it other than that. But anyway, it was sort of miraculous that it remained. But it was because of a series of events and kind of mistakes, really. But we're very grateful that all that.
So wasn't the other thing I remember from back then is the soil is actually very shallow, that you hit limestone really quickly, and that yes, they didn't expand the cemetery because of that as well.
I'm glad you mentioned that. I think that's why Captain McCamey was willing to sell that land, because by that time he had been there for 20 years. He had come from Tennessee in 1852. By 1873, he'd been there 20 years, and he'd been farming all that area. He knew, he was a very enterprising farmer, and he knew that his equipment wasn't going to be strong enough to cut through the limestone. I'm just guessing, but I think that's the reason he was willing to sell it to them. But so it's for a number of reasons that it's still there, but it's
thank goodness.
Exactly.
We're at 4:00, but if anybody needs to go, they're more than welcome to, but we're going to try to get a few questions answered really quickly. So hang tight. First question, how long did it take for the prairie plants to come up? Was it all at once or over years?
It was several years. We started with the West Prairie, and they came up when we stopped mowing. They immediately started coming up. But we picked sections, so we did it section by section. It was probably after the end of the second year, we'd probably converted all of it, stopped mowing all of both meadows.
How did you obtain your funding?
We're the Cemetery Association at the time, it was, I've said, it was still owned by the cemetery. The cemetery is very, very fortunate. It's comfortably well off because of an endowment that was given by an early Frankfurt person back in the 1950s. It's some land that has increased in value. So that's what started it. Now our new organization, we're starting from scratch, but that's at the time, that's what supported the efforts. And now we have these wonderful volunteers from the Master Naturalists that help us. But
do you provide any additional water to the prairie?
any additional water? No. We don't irrigate, we don't fertilize, we don't do anything except remove non-natives.
And somebody asked what size the prairie is, and I think you mentioned it's around 11 acres.
The whole prairie is not, the whole site is.
Oh.
Yeah. The prairie itself is between 2.5 and 3 acres, which is not very big, but.
Someone wanted to know what type of trees were added to the tree line in the against the houses.
Native trees like cedar trees. We have some sumacs in there. I'm trying to think what else. All native trees. Possum haw holly, things like that. Every tree, and of course, the only place we plant trees is along the tree line, and we don't plant them obviously in the prairie, but we always try to use native trees.
How do you maintain the invasives? By hand, chemicals?
No chemicals, by hand. And that's what has taken, that's the way we started it, and we're continuing to do that, and we think it's tedious, but it's the best way. And I think it's one of the reasons that it's as pretty as it is today.
Someone's wondering if the church has ever been used in a movie set. They said it reminds them of many shows set in the era and the simple but beautiful churches in the community.
Well, oddly enough, before I got so involved, what was that? Is it Walker Ranger?
Oh, yeah.
Show or something. Apparently, and this was not when I was on watch. I don't think it probably wouldn't have happened if I'd been involved. But anyway, I think they used it for some scene in a backdrop of one scene that they did. Other than that, I don't think it's been used in any movies that I know of.
Are photos of the church available for purchase anywhere?
No, but that's a good idea.
And someone wants to know if you can rent the church out.
Yes, I don't think I mentioned it, and I'm sorry I didn't, but we do. One way we raise money for our new organization is we have weddings in the church, and we rent it out for other events too. And it's a great way to bring in income, and it's just fabulous for small weddings. But yeah. No,
if anybody hadn't seen it, I did post the link to the Preservation Foundation in the chat, so you can copy paste.
Okay.
Do you have problems with Bermuda grass invading?
Oh, yes. There's a section in part of the West Prairie near the church where we have a problem. And in fact, I was just talking to a master naturalist this morning when we were out there. She comes every Thursday to work on the prairie. And amazingly, the East Prairie is pretty pure. It does, because it's away from the church. But years ago, for 40 years, the church was rented by another church, and they planted some Bermuda. And it's anyway, even though we've tried to plant but we've planted buffalo grass over it, it's still there, and so it kind of creeps into the prairie a little bit. But it's not as much. I mean, fortunately, it's not the whole prairie. And it's very hard. It's hard to get rid of, as you know. Yeah.
What denomination was the church?
Methodist. It was on the Methodist circuit back when the circuit riders were still coming through on horseback.
Mm-hmm. Let's see. Excellent, excellent, excellent. Field trip for future fall symposium. Well, we tried this year. it was on the docket.
Well, I would love for people to come. You're welcome to come. I hope we can all meet in person sometime. That would be great. I'd love for you to see it.
Do you have a problem with ragweed invasion?
Oh, that's what we're working on right now. In fact, I was just talking to this master naturalist, this lady this morning, and yeah, we have ragweed. And of course it's native, but it is one of the more invasive of the native plants. And we just have to pull it and pull it and pull it.
Well, that's all the questions we have for today. Thank you so much, Kathy, for presenting this and showing us this jewel.
Oh,
we really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. I love to share it with people. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, everyone. See you tonight at 7 o'clock when we have
Ricky Lennox.
Ricky Lennox, thank you. With native grassland restorations, how plants grow and how to improve them. So hopefully we'll see you tonight at 7. Don't forget, we still have the Bio Blitz going on all week. And if you aren't able to go out and take photos of Bio Blitz, our Sam Biology, Uncle Sam, has asked with help on IDing other observations from other people. So if you have time, please do that too. Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Kathy.